Hey people, I know it's been a long while since the last post.
You're goddamn right.
February has been a very busy month for me, but I am back now. Sorry I didn't release any video during this very important month. Black History Month it was. The brilliant idea of the great Carter G. Woodson. He was one of those wise black men like Sheikh Anta Diop or Chancellor Williams who had smelled the BS of imperial education from miles away. An education that was supposedly teaching the history of humanity, while in reality it was just teaching about how the white men had discovered everything in solo and that the other races owed everything to them, especially the black race, since they simply had no history. This of course is all delusional stuff the white man used to tell himself in order to inflate his huge ego. But delusions cannot stand against facts and science, and people like Carter G. Woodson could sense that the whole story as it was told back then was too fishy, and therefore he set about the work to discover the truth. But we're not here to talk about this great man, unfortunately, though a video on him is sure to come in the future. We are here for part 2 of the 1974 Cairo Symposium on the peopling of Kemet, aka Ancient Egypt. If you are new here, you must watch part 1 of this short series, link in the description or up here. A lot of you guys who liked the video on Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop have asked me to make a video on the symposium. I have already made the first part, but some people can't seem to find that first video on my channel. So what I'll do is that I'll link the video in the description below so that you can go watch it first, then you can come back and watch the second part with us. Again, you must watch the first part before you watch this one in order to understand everything. It's very important. So pause this video, go watch that one, then come back here. I'll wait for you. Did you watch it? Great. Then let's continue with more preliminary statements from our participants in the symposium. The show continues. Alright guys, so last time we had preliminary...
What?
Preliminary...
Oh my god!
Preliminary...
NANI?
Alright guys, so last time we had preliminary...
Practical exam and preliminary... अबे क्या बोलते हैं preliminary... अबे preliminary...
Preliminary.
Alright guys, so last time we had preliminary statements.
Bruh.
Preliminary.
Alright guys, so last time we had preliminary statements from Professor Sheikh Anta Diop and Xavier Soderbergh. We saw how thorough and informative Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop was in his preliminary statements, right? Well, in this video we are going to see the preliminary statements from his esteemed colleague, Professor Théophile Obenga. In this part, we also get some pretty interesting arguments from the opposing side. Right, let's just jump into it. We start with Professor Leclant. Professor Leclant began by stressing the African character of Egyptian civilization, but it was necessary to distinguish clearly, as Professor Vercouter had done, between race and culture. Physical anthropology in Egypt was in its infancy. Nevertheless, there was no justification for relying on the totally outmoded studies of Chantre, Elliott Smith, Sergei, or Dr. Derry. Furthermore, there had already been important restatements of current knowledge, such as that by Wiercinski. Groups working in Nubia had also shown considerable interest in physical anthropology, with the results that Nubia, reputedly poor in archaeological remains, paradoxically seemed likely to become far better known than Egypt in this respect. Archaeological expeditions now gave great prominence to osteological studies, an innovation which was greatly to be welcomed. In cultural studies, rock engravings, which showed an enormous degree of uniformity from the Red Sea to the Atlantic, were worthy of careful study. These traces had been left by successive cultural groups, hunters, herdsmen, or others. The peopling of ancient Egypt was a considerable problem, and it would be very premature at this stage to adopt a synoptic approach as a means of solving it. The problem should be approached through separate, precise studies. For this purpose, the collaboration of specialists in disciplines not represented at this symposium was indispensable. All the participants were general historians, qualified to compile and synthesize data supplied by specialists. Such data were, for the moment, very inadequate. In any case, it was retrograde to have recourse to authorities who were today completely outdated, such as Lepsius or Petrie. They might be recognized as having historical importance, but Egyptology had made great progress since their day. As for iconographical evidence, the only problem was to know how the Egyptians considered themselves in relation to other men. They called themselves Rame, that is to say, men. Other people they regarded as an amorphous mass extending in all directions, designated by the cardinal points. For example, the status of prisoners at Saqqara, 6th dynasty 2300 years before our era, were partly northerners, Asians and Libyans, and partly southerners, Nubians and Negroes. Stereotypes of northerners, whites, and southerners, Negroes, under the sandals of Pharaoh confirmed that representation.
Notice that at the beginning he stressed the African character of ancient Egypt, and by that he means that the Egyptians were culturally black African, but not racially. So you mean that everything about Egyptian culture was African, therefore similar to other African cultures, yet at the same time they weren't racially African. Okay. If anthropology and linguistics has taught us anything, it is that if two people from very distant geographical locations share the same culture, this most likely means that they were at some point part of the same culture, especially when they live in the same region. I mean, these two peoples, the Egyptians and Africans further south, are both of the African continent. And this thus implies that they were the same people at some point in the past, whether very distant or near. And this is very well supported by the fact that the Sahara was once a green, very dense forest, and peoples were living in there. Anyway, he also mentions the iconography and claims that we need to look at how the Egyptians viewed themselves compared to other people. Well, this had already been done by many, but I guess he never read those works. Scholars such as Champollion the Young, father of Egyptology by the way, Lepsius, Volney, Diop, all had done this work. They had already compared the Egyptian iconography compared to peoples around them. And all those great scholars claimed that the Egyptians represented themselves similar to the Nubians and other Africans further south, and this on statues and paintings. And there is evidence for this. Here is what Jean-François Champollion says on this topic. The first tribe that inhabited Egypt, that is, the Nile Valley between the Seine, Cataract, and the sea, came from Abyssinia to Sennar. The ancient Egyptians belonged to a race quite similar to that of the Kinus or Barabras, present inhabitants of Nubia. In the Copts of Egypt, we do not find any of the characteristic features of the ancient Egyptian population. The Copts are the result of crossbreeding with all the nations that have successively dominated Egypt. It is wrong to seek in them the principal features of the old race. Champollion continues. He describes how he viewed the races represented in ancient Egypt. This manner of viewing the tableau is all the more accurate because of the other tombs. The same generic names reappear, always in the same order. We find there Egyptians and Africans represented in the same way, which could not be otherwise, but the Nama, the Asians, and the Tamu, the Europeans, present significant and curious variants. Thus the father of Egyptology. The Asians and the Europeans present curious variants on the ancient Egyptian wall paintings and statues, while the Africans are represented in the same way. And this is true. An honest, unbiased look at the statues and paintings of ancient Egypt will lead you to that very same conclusion. I myself did a video on this topic, so Leclant, being a Frenchman himself, should have at least bothered to read the letters of his countryman Jean-François Champollion, the father of Egyptology. It's in their libraries, after all. I mean, look at these pictures. The Nubian prisoners share the same complexion with the pharaoh. And here is a jet black Egyptian man. What are you going to invent now? He is not Egyptian? The color is not actual? It's metaphorical?
You serious?
Come on. Face the facts like Jean-François Champollion did. Alright, let's move on to the next participant, Professor Galab. Professor Galab spoke of the successive elements which could be identified in the peopling of Africa between the Paleolithic period and the 3rd millennium before our era. In North Africa, a large quantity of stone objects dating from the 2nd Pluvial period had been found in the Nile Valley and the Oasis. Professor Galab distinguished at least 6 ethnic groups in Egyptian population during the Mesolithic period, which, however, were united by homogeneous culture. He considered that the human race during the Paleolithic period was more or less homogeneous and Caucasian. The first Negro types in Africa were Acellar men and Odorman men. In the late Paleolithic period, the black race appeared from the Atlantic. Okay, I can't read this with a straight face. In the late Paleolithic period, the black race appeared from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Among the earliest Egyptians, however, traces had been found of Bushmen, some of whose characteristics were modified as a result of their becoming acclimatized to Mediterranean ecological conditions. Even today, there were vestiges of this Bushman type in the population of Egypt. A Negro culture did not really appear prior to the Neolithic period. Oh my god, I tried to read this with a straight face. This man was just an ignorant, we just have to admit it. In the 1970s, he still believed that humankind started with Caucasians. This belief has been shattered by recent genetic studies. You can see for yourself what some of these top scholars believed back then. Jeez, was he even aware of the works of Dr. Leakey or Charles Darwin? Like... This man is just spitting the stuff he's been taught, the wrong stuff he's been taught in school, because that's what Cheikh Anta Diop said they were teaching them. It's pretty funny though, like the first Negroes appeared in Africa during the Paleolithic period. No sane scientist today could tell you this. And the human race was homogeneous and Caucasian. Galab was the biggest fraud in this discussion, I have to say. All he stated there has been thoroughly debunked by recent genetic studies of humankind. We know today, for instance, that the first humans on Earth had to be black-skinned people, and that therefore they resembled black Africans. Plus, modern DNA research on the human genome has confirmed this. Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop had already stated this in his preliminary statement, and recent studies proved him right. So we can't justify that Galab was just ignorant because at the time it was not common knowledge. No, he is a scholar. Okay, we got standards for scholars. Glogger's law was already around. It was already starting to get popular that all humans were coming from Africa. Cheikh Anta Diop had already stated this, and he was proved right by future studies, just like for the melanin study. Future studies corroborated Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop's studies. Same for linguistics. Western and Asian scholars used to believe that they came first and that black people came to Africa later from the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic. This they believed, but had no evidence to support it. No archaeological records, nothing. They just used to state it boldly with their titles of experts and hoped that people would believe it. And of course people did because they were the experts, so they believed it without questioning. Today, no serious scholar supports this view. And we also now know, thanks to modern genetic research, that the pale skin of the Caucasian people appeared only 22 to 28,000 years ago in the Caucasus. I know a lot of people claim that Caucasians appeared only 6,000 years, 6 to 8,000 years before, but this is a misinterpretation of the data. The 6,000 years figures is in relation to the migration of the Caucasian people. They first appeared in Asia in the Caucasus and stayed there up until 6,000 years ago. That's why they said, yes, Caucasians appeared 6,000 years ago in Europe and the Near East and the Mediterranean region. That's when they appeared in that region. Prior to that time, Caucasians were not present in that region. They were not present in North Africa. They were not present in Europe. They were not present in the Near East. They were just present in the Caucasus. So prior to that, everybody in those regions were black, according to recent genetic studies. If that makes you angry, you can take it up with the geneticists, not me.
We now know that modern humans had been around for about 300,000 years and that they originated in Africa. And yes, humanity was more or less homogeneous, Professor Galab, but humanity was not Caucasian. It was Black African. A scholar of your caliber should have known this in the 1970s. Glogger's rule had already been around. It had already been established. And the out of Africa model was already being established scientifically by works of great scholars such as Dr. Leakey and Cheikh Anta Diop and others. It was already becoming more and more popular because of the fossil records that were found on the African continent. But he ignored that because, well, he was comfortable in his delusional teachings. Galab was, let's just say it, an ignorant for a scholar of his caliber. Next scholar, please. The next scholar is Professor Abdallah from the Sudan. He was a partner of Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop and Dr. Théophile Obenga, but he was more on the side of the Western and Asian scholars. Professor Abdelgadir M. Abdallah did not think it important to establish whether the ancient Egyptians were black or Negroid. What was most remarkable was the degree of civilization they had achieved. Iconographic evidence made it clear that the creators of the Nabata culture had nothing in common with the Egyptians. Their anatomical characteristics were completely different. If the Egyptians were black, what color were the men of the Nabata culture? Turning to the subject of linguistics, Professor Abdallah stated that Kem did not mean black, and its derivatives did not refer to the color of individuals. He gave a linguistic demonstration in his turn to illustrate his theory, which differed from that of Professor Diop. He concluded that the Egyptian language was not a purely African language. It belonged to a Proto-Semitic group, as could be abundantly demonstrated by supporting examples. Professor Abdallah considered that the linguistic examples given by Professor Diop were neither convincing nor conclusive, and that it was hazardous to make too uncompromising a correlation between a language and an ethnic structure or individual. A comparison drawn between a dead language and living languages was bound to be inconclusive. The similarities which had been pointed out were fortuitous, and nothing was so far known of the evolution of ancient African languages. The evidence which had been given to support the theory of kinship was in fact far more consistent with the theory of the spread of ancient Egyptian throughout Africa than of its kinship with present-day African languages. Why should it be assumed that ancient Egyptian and Wolof were related, but not ancient Egyptian and Meroitic, for example? The language of Napata and Meroitic were at opposite poles from one another. Professor Abdallah hoped that the inquiry would be pursued in the strictest fashion. A. He considered it impossible to establish any automatic correlation between an ethnic group, a socio-economic system, and a language. B. It was impossible to reach scientifically valid conclusions by working on a large scale. There were almost no unambiguous examples in history of major migrations accompanying major cultural transformations. C. Negro was not a clearly defined concept today as far as physical anthropology was concerned. A skeleton did not provide evidence of skin color. Only the tissues of the skin itself were important in that respect. D. It was imperative to broach the study of paleopathology and of funerary practices without delay. This Professor Abdallah ignored a lot. The people of the Napata culture had nothing in common with Egyptians. What does he even mean by that? Does he mean the people of the Nakada culture of the pre-dynastic period or Napata of Kush? I am lost. In any case, both have a lot in common with the ancient Egyptians. Anyhow, he goes on to state that Kemet did not mean black, or Kem did not mean black. That's an ignorant statement, as he shall soon be proven wrong, not even by Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, but by a Western scholar, that is Professor Soneron, the expert on ancient Egyptian grammar. Dr. Obenga even mentioned this during one of his lectures at a university in Congo. Professor Théophile Obenga told us that he told Professor Abdallah, "Man, why are you doing this? You know Kemet means black, but you come and raise the debate again. That is not serious, man." Then he said, "Oh no,
Why are you gay?"
Professor Abdallah also stated that a comparison between a dead language and a living one was bound to be inconclusive, an ignorant statement. If that was the case, they wouldn't have been able to reconstruct language families. How did they know that English, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, and Ancient Greek were languages from the same Indo-European language family? He also mentioned there that Egyptian was of the Proto-Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. That view is untenable today. Egyptian is simply not part of the Proto-Semitic branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family. It is not. Egyptian is not a Semitic language. Diop statistically compared Wolof to Egyptian. The similarities were too much to be a mere coincidence. But of course, the scholars wouldn't accept that or even investigate this area further, because of their obvious aversion to the idea that Egypt was related to Black Africans whom they viewed as primitive savages. Instead, they chose to put Egyptian in its own branch today. Simply sad. But African linguists of those specific fields are sure to investigate these relationships between African languages further south and languages of the Nile Valley. In the future, I hope they will do this, and that would just be cool. On to the next scholar, Professor Sonneron. Professor Sonneron intervened in the course of a lively exchange of views on linguistic matters between Professor Abdallah and Diop. Professor Sonneron stated that in Egyptian, kem, in feminine kemet, meant black. The masculine plural of this one was kemu, and the feminine plural kemenet. The form kemtiu could mean only two things, those of Kemet, the inhabitants of Kemet, the Black Country. It was a derived adjective, nispa, formed from a geographical term which had become a proper name. It was not necessarily felt with its original meaning, confer, Frank, France, French. To designate black people, the Egyptians would have said Kemet or Kemu, not Kemtiu. In any case, they never used this adjective to indicate the black people of the African hinterland whom they knew about from the time of the New Kingdom onwards, nor in general did they use names of colors to distinguish different peoples. Right, Sonneron came in and corrected Abdallah in his ignorance about the word Kemet or Kem. It does indeed mean black. I addressed this argument of Kemet in a previous video that you can go find up here at minute 24 of that video. I think you will find it interesting. And now, finally, the one you've been waiting for, Professor Théophile Obenga. Professor Obenga in his turn reverted to the linguistic demonstration which had been begun by Professor Diop. After criticizing Professor Greenberg's method on the basis of the recent work by Professor Ivan Fodor, and remarking that since the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, it was an accepted fact that linguistic evidence was the most obvious means of establishing whether two or more than two peoples were culturally related, Professor Obenga endeavored to prove that there was a genetic linguistic relationship between Egyptian, ancient Egyptian and Coptic, and modern Negro-African languages. Before making any comparison, one must be on one's guard against confusing typological linguistic relationship, which gave no clue as to the pre-dialectical ancestor common to the languages being compared, and genetic relationship. For example, modern English, considered from the typological point of view, had affinities with Chinese. This is true, I know it. But from the genetic point of view, the two languages belonged to distinct language families. Similarly, Professor Obenga rejected the notion of a mixed language as linguistic nonsense. Genetic relationship depended on establishing phonetic laws discovered by comparison between morphemes and phonemes of similar languages. On the basis of such morphological, lexicological, and phonetic correspondences, one could arrive at common earlier forms. In this way, a theoretical Indo-European language had been reconstructed in the abstract and had been used as an operational model. It was indicative of a common cultural macrostructure shared by languages which subsequently evolved along separate lines. B. Professor Obenga drew attention to important typological similarities in grammar. The feminine gender formed by the use of the suffix t, the plural of nouns by the suffix w. He next analyzed complete word forms and noted similarities between those of ancient Egyptian and a considerable number of African languages. Between Egyptian and Wolof, the correspondence was total. This series of demonstrations led Professor Obenga to the conclusion that morphologically, lexicologically, and syntactic similarities amounted to convincing proof of the close relationship between ancient Egyptian and Negro African languages of today. This kind of parallelism was impossible between Semitic, Berber, and Egyptian. He then dealt with comparisons of ways of expressing to be in verb-noun combinations. The common archaic form in the Bantu language was the same in this respect as that of the most archaic form of ancient Egyptian. The analysis of negative morphemes, of the emphatic future, and of linking particles led to the same conclusions as the previous examples. Professor Obenga considered, therefore, that it would prove possible to discover a common genetic structure. Lastly, Professor Obenga spoke of what he considered to be the most interesting aspect of the comparison. He drew parallels between the forms taken in different languages by certain words, palm, spirit, tree, place, and also between certain small phonemes. For example, kem, black in ancient Egyptian, becomes kame, kemi, kem in Coptic, Ikama in Bantu, with the meaning of charred by exposure to excessive heat. Kame in Azer, cinder. Rome, men in ancient Egyptian, becomes Lomi in Bantu. The same phonemes have the same functions in different languages compared. Professor Obenga inferred from these comparisons that it would be possible in the future to identify a Negro-Egyptian language analogous to Indo-European. In this context, and in view of the undeniable common cultural background of all these languages, there was a sound basis for the development of future studies.
Hey. Now that was some scholarly talk, with thorough explanations of linguistic concepts displaying his deep knowledge of the field. Professor Théophile Obenga is indeed a great linguist. I don't have a lot of comments for this part. Just replay his part to appreciate and make sure you've understood all the valuable knowledge he has just shared. Kem indeed meant black in ancient Egyptian, and in ancient Bantu language, Ikama meant charred, which basically means black, since everything you burn turns black. And let's not forget that the hieroglyphic for Kem was written with a charcoal sign. That's a strong relationship. Professor Obenga proved the ancient Egyptian and other Negro African languages were morphologically, lexicologically, and syntactically similar. And this comes to add to the evidence that the ancient Egyptian culture is similar to that of other Africans further south. So I'm like, wait a minute, so the languages are similar, the culture is similar, but racially somehow they're not the same? Come on. The Indo-Europeans are children of Caucasians. The Caucasians of the Caucasus are the fathers of Indo-European language family. They're the ones that spread the language all over, and they share the same culture. It would be strange to say, no, you see, the Greeks were different. Yes, they may share a common culture with the Romans. Yes, they may share a language with the Nordic people, but they were not racially Caucasian. Okay. Professor Obenga's proof and demonstrations met little opposition, and actually it got praised by Professor Sonoran, the expert on the ancient Egyptian grammar. A link between Proto-Bantu and ancient Egyptian is very possible, since both Proto-Bantu people and ancient Egyptians are descendants of the Green Sahara people and East Africans. They shared the same region. Let's not forget as well that all the scholars present at the symposium described ancient Egyptian culture as African. This means they were similar to other Africans further south. The culture is of that of other Africans further south. You even heard some say that we should not confuse culture with race. By saying this, they admit that ancient Egypt and other African cultures are the very same, but then they refrain to say that they are racially the same too, in spite of the overwhelming iconographic evidence that suggests the same. Remember, Champollion said the ancient Egyptians and the other Africans are represented in the same way in ancient Egypt, and the Asians and Europeans and Mediterraneans represent curious variants. This they only say when it comes to ancient Egypt, that, oh no, yes, the culture is the same, but that doesn't mean they were racially the same. Oh, come on. Also guys, just compare Diop and Obenga's statements to those of other scholars. Diop and Obenga clearly did not come to play. They didn't come to play. They came prepared. They were like, man, I'm ready for a duel, man. As Diop said, armez-vous de science jusqu'aux dents. Arm yourself with science to the teeth. That's how they came to this thing. Anyhow, African and Afro-descendant linguists and scholars, please heed Dr. Théophile Obenga here and do some further studies on these issues. That would be amazing. I know the scholar Asar Imhotep, a student of Dr. Théophile Obenga, has done this already. He has a book on this topic. I am yet to get a copy of his book, but once I get it, I'm sure to share what I have understood from the book with you. He also has a YouTube channel, by the way. The YouTube channel is called Asar Imhotep. So go check out his work there. Amazing stuff. Check out his channel. Link in the description, of course. Right, now on to the next scholar, Professor Davis. Professor Davis briefly abandoned his role as rapporteur to inform the symposium of the unexpected results of an iconographic study. 3 manuscripts included representations of Black Egyptians, which merited consideration. After eliminating what could be attributed to biblical tradition, the descendants of Ham, and allegorical representations in a consciously archaic manner, Hades, night, there remained a variable proportion of Egyptians represented with Negro features and coloring. Admittedly, some of these were servants, but, and on this point of the scenes selected, were extremely interesting. Others were free Egyptians. Some of them, about a third of the participants, were around the table of Joseph, who was giving a banquet for his Israelite brothers seated at another table. Others were taking part in the sale of Joseph to Potiphar, who was himself represented as white. Probably the most remarkable aspect of these representations, which were consistently realistic in their details, lay in the characteristic costumes worn by these Black Egyptians, particularly in the 11th century Octateuch. The Negroes, who were clearly differentiated from Egyptians wearing beards and turbans, were in many cases carrying spears and wore a panther skin, leaving the right shoulder bare. Professor Davis considered these observations all the more interesting because there were considerable contacts between Byzantium and Egypt during the Fatimid period, and because the representations which dated from this period were far more realistic than in the older manuscript. It was very difficult to interpret these documents. They pointed both to the Byzantine cultural background and to the biblical tradition. Nevertheless, they reflected a northerner's view of the Egyptians which was not consistent with the standard white-skinned theory. Right. So you can hear here that they found some iconography from the Byzantine representing the Egyptians as black. They tried to drown the fish with Negro features. Come on, man. You said one of the guys, Potiphar, was represented as white. Why can't you use the same for the Egyptians? They weren't the only ones in ancient times who described and represented the ancient Egyptians as black. The Greeks, the Jews, the Romans all did describe the Egyptians as black-skinned Africans. Even in the Bible tradition that they want to avoid, the ancient Egyptians are listed among the descendants of Ham, the father of all the black nations: Cush, Nubia, Misraim, Egypt, Phut, Punt, Ethiopia or Somalia, and the rest of Africa, and Canaan, the Canaanites, another black nation. Regardless of whether you believe in the stories in the Bible or not, the fact that they listed Egypt next to Nubia and the rest of Africa as black nations says a lot about how these ancient writers viewed the ancient Egyptians. They viewed them as black people. So guys, that is it for the preliminary statements.
Hey, that's pretty good.
The next part will be about the general conclusion. And trust me on this one, you don't want to miss that part. It gets even more interesting. So press the subscribe button and the notification bell. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, and share. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you are new here and like what I do here. Press the notification bell too so that you don't miss future videos. And with that said, see you in the next one. Peace.